When I was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1920, we lived there for about 2 years after my birth, and I don't remember anything about the area. But we moved to Canton when I was just a little over my third year, and we lived at 15th Street Northwest, and I remember that so well because that was the first home that I remember living in, and the fact that my dad built a playhouse in the side yard. And I don't know why that sticks in my mind, but because of the playhouse, I think there were a lot of neighbor kids my age that liked to play over there. So we had a good time together. In the course of my early years, we did live at 5 different places in Canton, Ohio, 5 different addresses. One of the reasons being that our home burned down in the country and we had to move back to Canton. And I remember in this particular home I mentioned where we lived on 15th Street, we had a bank in front of the house that was about 5 feet high, and it was rather steep. And it was a great place for a city kid to sleigh ride, or sled. It didn't go very far, obviously. But I remember so well one of the first times out after the first snow of the year, I went down this little bank on my sled, and of course I went right off the end of it when it hit the bottom. And my glasses I was wearing special glasses at that time, and it just broke into smithereens right there on that stone sidewalk. And some of the things I did back in those years was activities where we didn't have any ball games that the young people have now, little leagues and so on. We didn't have those kind of activities. One of the things that sticks out in my mind, I never had a 2-wheel bike. I don't quite know why. I don't think it was that my dad wouldn't have bought me one, but I just didn't have one. But I remember I had the biggest tricycle he made. And I remember so well of riding my tricycle on 2 wheels. And of course, doing that over a period of time, one of the wheels, the one I was riding on, the rear wheel, got bent all out of shape, and that was the end of my tricycle. And the other activity that even the kids today don't engage in anymore, which was a lot of fun and quite popular back then, was we played marbles. They call them mibs. And we had, I remember, 2 distinct games that we played with marbles. We played in the schoolyard generally. The schoolyards weren't paved, just dirt. And we would draw a circle. For the one game, you draw a big circle about 4 feet square. And then everybody that was playing, and of course you could, a lot of young people could play at one time, maybe 6 or 8, 10 people would play at one time, 10 fellows. And we'd all have our mib bags, a little lambskin pouch with our various colored marbles in it. If you want to play the game, you had to ante up a marble, and we'd all put them in the pot. And the idea was that you had to stay behind this line, and you dare not hunch. So when you shot, you were shooting to see if you can get somebody's marble out of that pot, that circle. And if you were fortunate enough to hit somebody's marble and knock it out, then that was your marble. And you would have stayed in the circle when you hit that marble, and then you had the right to shoot out anybody's marble that you could while you were in the circle. And of course, if you were left in there with a bad shot, then of course you were subject to your friends shooting your marble. But that was quite a big thing. And of course, if they took your shooter, that was sad news. And that was bad news, and of course you usually tried to trade them out of it because it was your favorite shooter. You tried to trade them out of it by giving them 6 or 8 marbles. That would pay for the valuable shooter that you lost. When we moved from 15th Street up onto Alta Place, and Alta Place was at that time rather on the edge, the north edge of the town, the northwest section of Canton. And there was a big open field across from the house, and annually the Chautauqua came. Now the Chautauqua was, of course, a religious gathering or revival sort of thing that was always staged in a big, big tent. They put a big circus tent. And you can imagine the excitement in the neighborhood when the Chautauqua came to town. And so, of course, we, being so young, we didn't know much about what was going on, but we always looked forward to it because it was always held in the early evening before we had to go to bed. We had to go to bed when the streetlights came on, so it usually began about 6:30, 7 o'clock, and we had a chance to observe the people coming and going and so on. And there were occasions when the Chautauqua people would hire the local young people to pick up after the service and so on. But that sticks out in my memory. And then two other things that I think I've told the children about before, but my dad smoked cigars, and my Uncle Jack Hood was the head salesman for King Edward Cigar Company, so every time he came to visit us, he'd bring a box or two of cigars for Dad. So Dad familiarly had a cigar in his mouth, and so when I was quite young, I felt that I ought to take up smoking. So Dad was very obliging. He gave me a cigar. So one summer on Ala Place there, I remember so well, I was pestering my dad. We were sitting on the front porch. We pestered him for a cigar. Well, so he produced one of his cigars and put it in my mouth and lit it up, and boy, I was sitting there thinking I was king of the world here, and all of a sudden I decided that, well, it wasn't enough that my dad seen me smoke, but I was going to show my friends in the neighborhood. So I stepped down off the porch and started around the block. And I was puffing away on this cigar, and you can imagine, you don't know how to smoke, and I'm swallowing the smoke and coughing, and my eyes are watering, but I have to do it right because the kids are looking. I didn't get but about halfway up the block, and I felt a little squeak. So I came back to the house. I didn't want to let on that I wasn't feeling too good. And the kids were following me by now. There were several of my local friends that were following me down back to the house. So I got back to the house, and I got in the house, and I remember I got so sick, I was crawling around the dining room table on my hands and knees. I remember Mother was so excited about, here was her little boy just about to die, and here these kids were looking in the window. I felt so foolish, but I was so sick it didn't matter anymore, Oh. And another unusual circumstance happened. We had been out to the farm. We had this farm where we ultimately remodeled a home and moved out to, and then Vern moved back to Canton and so on. We rebuilt, but while we were still in Canton, we would go back and forth to the farm. And I remember one summer we had a pet, and my brother and I had a pet skunk. And of course, being farm oriented, we didn't think too much about it, and we never had it de-skunked. We didn't even think about that. We had our pet skunk, and we had it there in town. He'd run around the house, and he had a little cage and so on. And we'd show our friends, and they were quite impressed with the fact that the little skunk was their neighbor and didn't seem to bother anybody. They enjoyed playing with it. But anyway, when my brother and I got tired of having him as a pet, he got to be a nuisance, and we had to take care of him. You know how things get old for kids. And so we had two of our neighbors were little girls about our same age that we played with. And we'd take the skunk over to their house and never thought anything about it. So finally we decided we'd just give it to them. They wanted the skunk and we didn't, so we gave them the skunk. And it wasn't more than a day later that their mother and dad came over to our house and complained bitterly about the fact that the skunk had messed up their sofa. And and they were really put out because, of course, he wasn't de-skunked, and he did stink up their house. And
these showers away, and if I kiss you in the garden, in the moonlight, will you pardon me?
And not only got rid of the skunk, they had to get rid of some of their furniture. When I was a little older, I was oftentimes taken out to Lake Springs Park or to High Mill Park because, in the case of Lake Springs, my father's great uncle owned that, Marshall Clay, and then Adele Rohr, a great aunt of my father, owned High Mill Park, and they were both swimming lakes, and so I was exposed to them at an early age, and I just loved to swim. And I remember we just begged Mother and Dad to take us swimming. Of course, because we could swim free, why we, I suppose, did swim more frequently than we might otherwise have. But the first activity I got involved in at both of these parks was I took care of the baskets. And back in those days, the baskets were important because everybody seemed to want to rent a basket to put their clothes in while they swam. Now, in later years, I well remember at Clay's Park why that simply was not one of the things that they did. We had baskets, but we didn't rent any. But anyway, one of my first wishes was that I could be a lifeguard someday, because here I was back at the counter handling these baskets, and that got to be old stuff, and I'd see these hotshot lifeguards out there on these big chairs diving in, saving people, and I wanted to be a lifeguard. As it turned out, I never was a lifeguard. But I think from the very beginning, because of Dad's business, being in business for himself, and my brother John and I were sort of oriented and urged by our father to get into that same business, so we wanted to be businessmen. What that involved at those times, I'm sure we didn't really know, but as it turned out, I took accounting and business administration in college with that idea. I had a wonderful childhood, really, and family life. Two wonderful parents. My mother was a city girl and lived in Canton. She worked, as I remember, in the Dime Savings Bank in downtown Canton, which is not there anymore. And Dad, of course, was a farmer. Although he, at an early age, got into the foundry sand business and was a businessman in his own right, he basically was a farmer. And I remember him telling the story about he, as a young man, wanted to marry somebody with breeding and education, and so he set out to marry a city girl, and that's what he did. And well, in the early years, they were very happy. We had a wonderful home life, and we used to go a lot of places together, do a lot of things together. It was only that in the later years, when they were both about 60 years old, where they were divorced. But it was we had a happy time together, and it was just unfortunate. I was talking about jobs a while ago, taking care of the baskets at the checkout counter at Lake Springs and High Mill Park, but really the first job, really serious job that I, as a young fellow, engaged in, I think, was a job I had one summer cleaning bricks. And the way that came about, our house had burned down in the country, and we had moved it back to Canton, but we were planning to rebuild. So it just happened that simultaneously we had a road building program there in the Canal Fulton area where they were replacing the old brick road that passed in front of the house. And they were widening from 16 feet to 20 feet. And they were giving the locals, whoever wanted them, the bricks out of the road. So my brother John and I spent one summer, gathering up the bricks and hauling them up to the house that was partially started. And then it was our job to take a brick hammer and clean those bricks just days on end. With regard to my involvement in World War II, I think it appropriate to start by explaining that I was in school in college, and I started my senior year at Ohio Wesleyan in late August or early September of 1941, and hoping, of course, to finish and graduate. But as we all know, Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th of that same year, and I was so anxious to graduate with my class, feeling, of course, that I could do better in the service if I had a degree. So I quit school and went to work in the Ordnance Department in Cleveland, Ohio, hoping to do correspondence work, which I did for a time, and I would go back to Wesleyan periodically to take my tests. And I really was looking forward to finishing with the class of 42. But I was working in the Ordnance Department in Cleveland, and of course it was in the war effort, so to speak, so that I was deferred a couple times because of my job. But it got to the point where I was not happy with that situation because the men my age were going into service, and I knew very well that an older man could do my job. So, although it was against my mother and dad's wishes, I told my draft board, the chairman of the draft board, that I wanted to go into the service, and rather than volunteer, I asked him to call me in the normal course of events so that it wouldn't fall so hard on mother and dad. So, incidentally, Bill Falmouth, the father of Judge Falmouth, Gene Falmouth, was the chairman of the draft board, and he did call me in the next draft call. So I left for the service in February of 1942, or 1943, and I was overseas until December of 45. And during that time, I was first put in Army Ordnance Corps. And when we got overseas, for a time we were stationed in England, and early on in the war, when the Americans entered, the Germans with their 88s were really wreaking havoc with our tanks. So our group of ordnance personnel was stationed at a depot in England at Warminster, where we actually were modifying all the new tanks that came over with an extra inch of armor plate on the turrets and some of the important places on the tanks, where they found that these German 88s were getting to our tanks. And then on D-Day, and I remember that D-Day so well, I was in Southampton ready to go shortly thereafter, and I looked up in the sky and he heard this roar. And you could hardly see the sky for planes. And of course they weren't only motorized airplanes, there weren't any jets then, or many to my knowledge, but anyway it was full of gliders, which were just, of course, a one-time flight over into France and parts of Germany. But when we got overseas, or when we got over the Channel in July, the Army was pretty well bogged down around Cherbourg and St. Lo. And of course we were behind the lines for the most part, and we were in what we called enemy ordnance. We were gathering enemy shells, ammunition, guns, cameras, anything of that nature, and confiscating them and finding them and returning them to the various depots around that part of France. And one of our early jobs was to guard the ammunition dump there just on Cherbourg and the shores of the English Channel. And in the course of doing the guarding there, of course you realized that you were taking quite a chance, because there were a lot of the GIs that would come in there with guns they had found, German guns they had found or captured, and they were trying to find ammunition to suit, and they would fire those guns rather indiscriminately. And of course you were always concerned about the whole dump going up, and so when we were on duty we just resigned ourselves to it. We'd build our little shacks out of German 88 cases with the 88 still in them, just to have shelter from the rain and the weather. And the minute we were off duty, of course, we got well away from there, but in a matter of a couple weeks after we had pulled guard duty, why, the whole dump blew up.
On 17 15th August, explosions destroy large stores of ammunition at a former Nazi ammo dump in the harbor area of Cherbourg, causing a number of deaths. Acres of ammunition were affected. Among the items stored by the Germans in this area were unexploded American 500-pound bombs dropped by our aircraft during the siege of Cherbourg.
And I remember Mother saw the newsreel at home, and of course, knowing that I was in the Cherbourg area, was quite concerned, but things turned out well after all. But to make a long story about this long war short, why, being in enemy ordnance, we did a lot of looking into the salt mines in Germany. We would go down into the mines looking for, initially looking for ammunition and poison gas, which we found in abundance. But interestingly enough, what we did find, and not me personally, but members of my own company, found in some of the mines the German crown jewels and the tapestries that they'd stolen from all over Europe. And one of the most interesting things was they found a big casket with a big ornate ribbon across it, and it said Hitler on it. And of course we thought that we had found the body of Hitler, that in fact he was dead, although he was rumored to have been killed. We thought, well, now we found the body of Hitler. Well, as it turned out, it was the casket of Hindenburg, who Hitler had decorated at some point in the past time in some public display. But I was very fortunate during the war. As I say, I was pretty much behind the enemy lines most of the time, except around one of those towns where the cathedral was so important, just outside of Cherbourg. Can't think of the name of it, but and I remember the smell of death there in Kassel, Germany. We bivouacked in Kassel, Germany, after they had shelled the town almost to ruins. And they said that there was about 40,000 dead under the ruins of that city. And you can imagine, you lived on top of the ruins in what was left of some of the apartments. And I'll never forget that smell. Getting back to marrying my sweetie before the war, we were quite fortunate to be married. We were able to be married before the war. And we chose not to have any children until I got back. But I remember we met over at Lake Springs. And it was just a chance meeting, of course. It was some kind of a group had a meeting there for those young people who were going to Ohio Wesleyan that fall, which would have been the fall of 38. And in the course of the afternoon, I met a number of people my age, of course, who were going to Wesleyan, but I remember particularly Marilyn. We met there, and although she was going with someone else at the time, I must say I was impressed, but I was frustrated too, because I knew she was going with someone else. And I think, I can't remember really well, but I don't think we dated for most of the first year because of her other involvement. But I think in the second year and thereafter we did date, and eventually couldn't hardly stand to be apart. I don't really remember specifically about our first date. Around the campus there, we had to walk quite a distance to our classes from our dorms or our fraternity houses, and I would rather guess that early on, after she broke off with her other friend, that we probably started simply by walking back and forth to classes. I really don't remember a specific first date. Yes, I remember our wedding day quite well. June 27, 1942. See how quickly I can say that and not have to stop and think. But it was a beautiful day, and my dad was the best man, and I remember Dad too. He bought a white suit for the occasion, and I had never seen him in a white suit before, and we kidded him about it, and I don't know that he ever wore it on any occasion after the wedding. But needless to say, that my bride was beautiful in her wedding gown, and in fact, I think we have pictures on our wall here at the house. But and I remember my picture. I looked so skinny as though I wasn't old enough to be married. But anyway, we had a reception then at the Akron City Club, I believe it was, which is now part of the Akron University campus, or right across from it. But the thing, aside from the joy of being married that day, was the fact that we had a Mercury two-door, and there was a big shelf under the back window, and I got to the ready to dress for the wedding. I couldn't find my shoes, and I had special shoes. I think they were black and white, but they were nice shoes to go with my outfit. And I couldn't find those shoes, and here I was about to be married in my bare feet, so I went downtown, hurried downtown, bought a pair of shoes. I got back to the church, and in the course of getting out of the car and rummaging around for what was there, I found the shoes that I had brought to wear on the back window of this Mercury. So I think that was the first time I had two pair of black and white shoes. Mother and I consider ourselves so fortunate and so blessed by God in so many ways, of course, but in that we've had 4 beautiful children who have been a blessing to us and who are our pride and joy. And, of course, little Kathy, who passed away when she was about 10, we so often think about and talk about her because we wonder, of course, at this date and this time in our lives what our second daughter would have been like. She was just a beautiful, wonderful, precious little girl. And I remember when she suffered so during those last months and had to have some painkiller daily or even more often. And I'll never forget, and I think this should be noted well, because Dr. Conklin, who was our neighbor about a half mile or 3/4 of a mile away, for some months during Kathy's last illness, came over any time of the day or night, just any time of the day or night. Any time we called when she was in great pain, he would come over and tend to her. And it was so difficult for Mother and I and the other children, as far as that goes, some of whom were pretty young and didn't really understand what was happening, because we didn't talk about her dying. Of course, we kept hoping and praying. But I remember inviting them all, the family, together in the living room one day, having been told by the doctor that Kathy wouldn't live very much longer, and I told the family. I'll never forget the feeling we had in the prayer we said for our dear little Kathy. Of course, our Rick and Rob and Pam, we're just so thankful that they're healthy and well and have families of their own. We're just so thankful. Gosh, Pam was really a model daughter, just a joy. And I think the thing that really impressed the father about his only daughter, as it turned out, was that she was a bookworm, which to some was not a particular blessing perhaps, but I'll tell you, I was so pleased because she learned a lot so quickly. And she was a wonderful student. In fact, I think she graduated cum laude from Texas Christian, but she was such a happy girl, and I just was so thankful to have such a sweet daughter. And even today, I love her so, and I think about her so often. The boys, I'm just so thankful for them. They're just doing so well, and with such wonderful, precious families. When I think of my grandchildren, I just I thank the Lord every day for my grandchildren, for my sons-in-law, my daughter-in-law. I just am so thankful, and Mother is so thankful that we've been so blessed by God. You know, as I look back on my almost 70 years now, a man thinks about a lot of things that maybe he wishes he had done or not done. And I often reflect on the fact that, like when a young man or even a young lady is 8 or 10, why, they're looking forward maybe to getting their first bicycle. And what a joy that is. And then maybe when they get to be 20, they're looking forward to getting their first car. How exciting that is. But I've found now in my 69th year, 70th year, remember George Milhouse used to say he was consuming his 70th year, so I'm really consuming my 70th year. But the one thing above all else that I'm so proud I did was marry Marilyn Welcome. That's really the greatest thing that happened to me. And I think it takes a man, I think it takes a husband a while, at least it took me a while, to really appreciate and understand the role of a wife and a mother and a grandmother, and what an anchor, what a rock that precious wife is. When one thinks on their childhood and days gone by, especially when you're almost 70 years old, your mind races back to so many things that prevailed back then, and of course to so many things that didn't prevail or weren't available back then. And by way of technology, there were so many things that we take for granted now that simply weren't available. But I would be constrained to talk about something a little different, more in a philosophical way about those times, because I think, although the technology is important, developments are important, I think the most important thing is to understand and to realize that our country has changed philosophically, morally, spiritually, to the point where I have, for the last many years, been very concerned about its survival. Now, I don't say that to excite anyone, because things will go on, and I'm sure we'll carry on. But I really am concerned, and have been concerned, about what has gone on in our country by way of the government red tape and regulation, which is really doing for the individual what he should be doing for himself. In fact, I'm reminded of a story where this country family had a pet raccoon. Or you could use the same analogy with most any wild animal which is taken out of the wild and put into an unnatural habitat, in a cage, for example, and they become dependent upon people for their sustenance and for their very life, really. And then, at some later time, after they get used to all these things that they didn't have in the wild, they're turned loose again, and they just can't cope. And I think that analogy can be used with regard to the American people, in that the government more and more is doing so many things for the individual that he's getting farther and farther away from the ability to do for himself. When you stop to think about the history of our country, which is quite short, a little over 200 years, and yet when you think back at those times, if you know your history, you realize that people landed on these shores with a shirt on their back and really not much more. And look what has been built up over a very short span of time in the great scheme of things. And yet, I feel very strongly about the fact that unless we get back to the feeling of the need for the individual to be responsible for his own actions and for his own livelihood, we're going to be in great trouble. As I'm reminiscing and thinking back on my life, one of the analogies that comes to my mind that has to do with happy, enjoyable Christian living would be this. Now, you know, when we get a new appliance for our kitchen, or a new tool for the workshop, or a new toy for the kids, we're always included, always is the instructions, sometimes quite detailed, other times rather elemental, but I think it's safe to say that in most cases all of us rather ignore those until we have a particular need to find out what isn't working right or why it isn't working right. In other words, we don't bother with the instructions much. We just go ahead and do our thing. We've seen other people with the same toys or tools, and we figure, well, we can do it too without reading the instructions. Now, you know, the human body, the humankind, are the most intricate thing that God ever made. And with every human being, in my analogy, comes the Bible. In other words, we do have an operator's manual. I don't think we think of it as such. I know in my earlier years I didn't think of it as such, but as I reflected upon it, it is a very good analogy, I feel, because in the Bible, between the pages of the Holy Bible, is everything that one needs to know to live a Christian life. And I mean, when I'm talking a Christian life, I mean a good life, a happy life, a useful life. And I don't mean to say that I'm any more perfect than anybody else, because certainly we're all sinners. The only perfect man was Jesus Christ. But insofar as we can strive to be the type of Christian that the Lord wants us to be, we can't do it without reading the instructions and following the precepts in the Holy Bible. And if there's anything I would like to leave to my posterity, I would say, above all else, read and understand your Bible and do it daily. There's one other thing that I would like to say that might be helpful to others. As I read my Bible, and I try to read it often, I think often of I think it's in Thessalonians where Paul is speaking. And he says, in just one short verse, he says three things that I have found are very important. He says, first of all, rejoice always. Now, as we all know, we have our ups and downs in this life. But what he's indicating here is that we can be thankful and rejoice always, because it's sort of like having looked at the last page of the book and finding out what the ending is before you read it, as I know some people do. And in this case, if we believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, then we have a future to look forward to. It doesn't matter what happens here on this earth. We have a future to look forward to, and that's why he urged his friends to rejoice always. He urged them to be thankful for all things. Now here again, all things sometimes include hardship and maybe heartbreak. But still in all, the Lord God is our Creator. He's our sustainer. He sustains the universe. He's our provider. And above all, He's our Redeemer. And here again, if you have a Father who loves you so much that He is all those things to you, then by all means you should be thankful. And then he said, as a third thing that he was concerned about his followers doing, he said, pray without ceasing. Now, you and I know that he doesn't mean that we spend all of our time on our knees someplace or even sitting or standing someplace praying, but what he wants us to do is to be aware that God is all around us. And I find the first thing when I get out of bed in the morning, or even before I get out of bed in the morning, I say, Lord, I thank you for letting me see this new day, and just make me useful to somebody today. Just make me be a blessing to somebody. Now, I know as a practical matter, some days I'm not a blessing at all. But nevertheless, one has to strive. I mean, the only perfection in this world is in Jesus Christ. And we are all imperfect. We'll always be imperfect until we're with Him. But if we strive to help others and to be effective when we are out in public. For instance, when as I say, before I get out of bed, I pray. When I'm driving up to a house to list a house or sell somebody on buying a house, I say, Lord, let me help these people. You know, just let me be a friend to them. And I'm sure I want to sell that house. I need to make a living, but let me be, first of all, helpful to these people. Or when I go up the steps of the home to see Aunt Helen or Marguerite, I say, Lord, just let me do something when I see these dear old ladies that will bring some joy to their life. Whether it's a word I can say, a kiss I can give them, or a little trip in the wheelchair, but just help. I think this is so important to realize that prayer does change things. The Lord answers prayer. And there is nothing in my life that I don't pray about, even the littlest things. And even driving along in the car, I often think of some dear friends that have problems. I mean, you have problems. You know people that have problems. You have problems. I pray for my grandchildren, for my children. But when you talk about praying without ceasing, if you feel that way about your Lord and you believe in prayer and you have the faith, you won't have to be reminded to pray. You'll find that it'll just come out, just wherever you are, whatever you're doing, it'll just come out.